And a warm good evening to you. Over the past few months, we've witnessed businesses around the globe adjust rather rapidly to survive, which then evolved as we delved into uncharted territory and unearthed new ways of working. And some of these adjustments saw businesses thrive with better productivity, an invigorated sense of innovation and employee engagement as we mostly work from the comfort of our own space. So we're starting to wonder, is the silver lining that the current pandemic has already been a catalyst to unlock the potential already there? It's June 2020. We're seeing restrictions ease, allowing businesses to assess what their workplaces of the near future will look and feel like. So what has worked during these restricted times? And how can we lock in those gains as we move into the future? Answering these two questions is the intent behind our webinar. Welcome to ISO Life, Lessons and New Ways of Working live webinar hosted by the Australian Institute of Business. For those unfamiliar, the Australian Institute of Business is Australia's market share leader in online MBA programs, with our alumni reaching across over 90 countries. The organisation itself has 35 years of experience in delivering higher education, solidifying us as one of the most established private higher education providers in Australia. My name is Dr. Alicia Stanway, a member of the academic team, and today your host. Just a few minor comments before we kick off with our exceptional panel. There is a chat feature for those joining us live. We do encourage you to engage with other attendees. There is also a Q&A feature, which we do encourage you to send your questions to our panel members, which we can answer towards the end of the webinar. Both those platforms will be moderated by our marketing manager, Stephanie George. And finally, if you did register for this webinar, we will send you a copy of the recording, and we do encourage you to share those with your networks. Our executive panel consists of Martin Hazy, CEO of Business SA, Sarah McCann-Bartlett, CEO of the Australian HR Institute, Razor Buckley, General Manager of the American Chamber of Commerce in South Australia, Brendan Marie, Vice President Asia Pacific at 8x8, and Simon Pohl, Global Director for Design at Unispace. Wow, from the macro to the micro, we really are in for a dynamic discussion in this hour. But first, the theoretical lens. Now, the Harvard model of HR serves as an appropriate theoretical frame to focus this webinar. Briefly, the model is comprised of 5 components. Now work with me while I give you this visual. So the model starts off with your stakeholder interests, so your customers, your employees, your shareholders. And at the same time, we have your situational factors. Now, hello pandemic, hello disruption. And together they influence our HR policies. Now, when done right, that leads to positive HR outcomes. And then over time, we have longer term consequences. Now, unable to discuss the full model, we really want to hone in on ways of working as we're seeing now, and that is leading to positive outcomes. And we want to use that insight to consider how we might embed those ways of working into our HR policies and workspaces that can be sustained into the future. To set the macro scene for our webinar, I'd like to start with Martin Hazy. Martin's current role is CEO of Business SA, South Australia's leading business employer and membership organisation. Now, prior to this, Martin was elected to the office of the Lord Mayor for the City of Adelaide, where he served a 4-year term and delivered a number of key innovations to drive that economic growth for Adelaide. He also brings a wealth of entrepreneurial experience in the retail sector, and some MBA alumni have had the absolute pleasure of his teachings in entrepreneurship across Australia. I'm also humbled to mention that Martin is one of our alumni. Martin, as a result of the disruption we've experienced so far in 2020, what impact have we seen on sectors across South Australia? And as a state, how are we positioned for the future?
Thank you very much, Dr. Stanway, and greetings everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much indeed to the Australian Institute of Business for hosting. And welcome from Adelaide, South Australia. As CEO of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry here in South Australia, we have this unique insight because we work across some 17 industry sectors And we work across sectors from literally startups to sole traders, to small business, to corporates, national companies, multinational companies. So we get a great deal of diversity in terms of the view that what we've seen in terms of the impacts of COVID-19. And if I could say up front that at first in the, let's say the February period earlier this year, it's clear there was an impact on all industries. There was an impact on all sectors. But as we moved, and this is certainly a South Australian perspective, if not a national perspective here in Australia, is that we've seen that lens, let's say, narrow a little bit, whereby we've seen it mature to the point whereby there has been a more dramatic impact on some sectors than others. So it's been probably best described as an extraordinary disruption to business as usual. And we've had feedback from sectors which have been impacted in what I would describe as a catastrophic way, through to other sectors which have actually almost perversely benefited economically as a consequence of the disruption. And we're seeing the polar opposites at either end, and in so many ways, everything in between. But if we look generally speaking, the agricultural sector in Australia is doing particularly well, and demand is relatively strong. Prices and yields and crop prices, and even the resources sector in some areas is continuing to do reasonably well. But then if we look at the other end of the spectrum and we look at the consumer-facing industries, those sectors which are dependent upon you and I as consumers, those sectors which are dependent upon international tourism, international conferencing, accommodation providers, tour operators, retailers, hospitality sector, we would have to say that the impact has been extraordinary. And we would also say that with regards to those businesses, those sectors which are reliant or more reliant, either directly or through their own supply chains on international tourism, this is going to be a long haul proposition. But also then, we look at what impact it's had in terms of our own staff, our own workplaces. And this plays out in many different ways. Industrial relations is one of the core service provisions that Business SA, as a Chamber of Commerce and Industry, plays for quite literally many thousands of members across 17 industry sectors. And a lot of employers have had to deal with a great deal of complexity in terms of, well, how do they manage their staff? How do they lead their staff? What does the industrial relations environment look like during COVID? What does that mean in terms of how does that couple up with the federal and the state government stimulus packages, which have all been progressively rolled out in South Australia and around the nation? So there's been no playbook. There's been no script for 2020. Employers in so many ways have had to work this out on the run. And the Chamber of Commerce and Industry here, Business SA, is that we, in many ways, in terms of our own workloads and inbound contact traffic into Business SA, has gone up something like 500% since about February this year. So my team has been, in so many ways, stretched to the limit, looking after those who we are designed to look after, which is effectively our diverse membership base across 17 industry sectors, Alicia. We also then we take it a step further, and we look at what role is technology playing in this. Now, clearly it's profound. Every organisation, every employer is now looking inwardly in terms of what role technology plays. Our own experience is that we had about 12 projects destined for digitisation over the next 12 months. And necessity is the mother of all invention. And in so many ways, 75% of those projects were done in 10 weeks when we had slated to do them over 12 months. But I don't think that's a unique story, because I'm hearing this from so many organisations that they've accelerated the rollout of their digitisation projects across their organisations. We do learning, we do training. In the first instance in February this year, March this year, we were severely impacted. So we've had to implement our own pivot strategy, as so many in the learning and the training space have. Then we quickly look at flexible workplace arrangements in terms of bringing our teams back to work, because in South Australia, we're in that phase at the moment. I went from 50 on-site employees in February, very quickly down to 3, and now I'm back to 40. So that gives you a sense of the continuum that's played out over the last 12 or 13 weeks. And we've had to recraft, like many employers are doing, our flexible workplace arrangements, because we've proven that our team can work very effectively from home and from remote locations. And this makes a big difference, I think, in the future to how we employ, how we engage, and where our employees are actually located. As a CEO of this organisation, it's quite clear to me that my team do not need to be in my office from Monday to Friday. Also, we look at productivity. And I think this would be shared by so many organisations across the ecosystem, is that in so many ways, productivity has actually gone up. Speed to market has gone up. Pathways to market, reach, defining new customer groups, new markets, has gone lateral in so many ways. Creativity, innovation has exploded in so many ways. And it is, I think, necessity again is the mother of all invention. We've had to do these things so that our enterprises are sustainable, because when you're in a position where business as usual is just no longer, for many organisations, a viable proposition, change is thrust upon you. You've got to embrace it. So for the leaders amongst the group that are listening today, the incumbency of leadership over the last 12 to 14 weeks has probably never been greater. Your communication with your teams and those reporting to you and with your boards has never been greater in terms of the need for clear, concise and consistent communication and leadership. And we've all experienced it. Alicia, I'll leave it at that. I'll close by saying that we are seeing extraordinary adaptiveness by so many businesses across so many sectors. We are seeing some industries which are lightly impacted by COVID-19 and work from home conditions. And we're seeing other businesses which are severely impacted. There are still businesses in South Australia. There are many businesses in South Australia whereby their revenue still sits at 0. There are other businesses which are 200 to 300% up on what they were in February this year. And we are literally seeing this great diversity of the polar opposites of those outcomes and literally everything in between. And then we begin to ask ourselves, what does competitive advantage look like in the future? So I look forward to hearing everybody else's comments. Thank you, Alicia.
Martin, valuable insight for that sector perspective, and really humbling to see the advantage that some businesses are taking right now to thrive in these environments. Thank you very much. Now to focus in on that HR narrative, let's bring in CEO of the Australian HR Institute, Sarah McCann-Bartlett. For those unfamiliar, Sarah had to hit the ground running, as we say, when she was appointed to CEO in February this year. Yet prior to this, Sarah served as the Director General of the British Constructional Steelwork Association in London for close to a decade, so has had absolute significant influence across construction and agricultural industries, and will no doubt have significant influence here. Sarah, with your bird's eye perspective of the HR sector in Australia right now, tell us, what themes are you seeing across organisations as a whole?
Thanks, Alicia. For me, I think there are 3 things that are standing out at the moment. The return to the physical workplace or not, what this means for organisational culture, and in fact, whether we need to rethink culture, and what the essential skills and competencies for the future are. So as a result of the sometimes surprising positive experiences that many of us have had working from home, we're all predicting that more employers will want to work flexibly in some way. However, as part of that change, I also think that we're going to see a shift from what I call employer-led to employee-led workplaces. So previously, the majority of employers set the terms of flexible working policies. And actually, they weren't that flexible. They'd specify the span of hours and only certain roles could be done remotely. In the employee-led workplace, employers will determine where and to a certain extent when they work. And that's going to be at all levels of the organisation. Of course, the business still needs to deliver. So increased and personalised flexibility does need to benefit all, the employee, their team, and the business. Earlier this month, we surveyed HR practitioners. This is RE's third COVID-19 pulse survey. In the latest survey, 80% of HR leaders said they believe that their organisation will allow more employees to work remotely to some degree due to the experience of COVID-19. And when we asked them why, their answers were that people have come to enjoy not commuting and having more time with their family, that as an employer, they'll need to offer added flexibility in order to remain competitive in the market. COVID-19 has demonstrated that flexible working can be done effectively and productively, and there's the opportunity for them to reduce costs. Also in our survey, 68% of HR practitioners also said that remote working was being considered as part of their organisation's long-term real estate planning. In some ways, less office space. One question that a lot of companies are grappling with is, how do we maintain creativity and innovation if people aren't in the office to collaborate together? So some are considering remote working as the norm, but adapting their reduced office space for collaboration and innovation. So in these cases, employees would come into the office for specific reasons, such as collaboration, but their main workplace might be remote. Now, not every job can be done remotely, but more and more technology is going to enable this. So thinking about remote working and changes to the physical location leads for me to questions of culture. The employee-driven workplace isn't just about where and when you're physically working. There's been this slow burn over the past few years about leaders bringing their authentic self to the workplace, which has been accelerated by COVID-19. And as a result, we've seen more of who our colleagues and our leaders are through this lockdown. For those employees who felt that they had to adjust who they were or how they behaved to fit into the workplace culture, this experience has allowed them to be genuinely genuine. And some believe that this is actually going to drive more inclusive workplaces. Another question that I'm asking is whether the rise of remote working is heralding the demise of organizational culture. So how do we make sure that we maintain our culture when we're remote from each other, but taking a step back, do we actually need one homogeneous culture? What about a set of broad principles or values and more team-based cultures? I actually recently had this discussion with a global company with a very geographically scattered workforce who internally have been having the same discussion themselves. Regardless of whether we move towards a set of broad principles or values, it's definitely key to maintain employee engagement and ensuring that teams and colleagues maintain their strong relationships. And this is going to be particularly important for new employees. And speaking of values, one value that everybody has embraced and we're going to have to continue to embrace is trust. Some of you might have noticed that some of the online discussions have focused on managing remotely and how, as a manager, do I know that my team is doing what they should be doing? Some are suggesting clocking in, clocking out. Others are considering software to measure keystrokes or even periods of high and low concentration. But actually, trust is really the answer. You're going to have to trust your employees to get the job done. Actually, you're going to have to trust them to want to get the job done. So another area that I'm finding really interesting at this time is the effect of the change on the type of skills organisations are going to need in the future. We've already heard that if we think about COVID-19, organisations made these fundamental changes to their business models at a really rapid pace and with very little opposition. So we became more change able, 2 words, as a workforce. But we need to make sure that we nurture and grow this capability and more into the future, as the world is going to continue to change at an increasingly rapid pace. So I see an enormous need to invest in what used to be called soft skills, awful name, disastrous name. I call them essential skills, as well as change ability, again 2 words, as well as change ability, skills such as creativity, imagination, curiosity, and resilience are going to be key. The World Economic Forum talks about cognitive flexibility as a new essential skill, being able to make radical shifts in your behavior, your mindset, and your perspective depending on the situation. Of course, it almost goes without saying that digital competency is going to be an absolute must-have for the whole workforce as well. In our most recent pulse survey, respondents confirmed this, indicating a number of skill areas that as HR leaders, they think will need to be developed to sustain their new operating models. And the themes included resilience, flexibility, digital skills and virtual capabilities, communication, and agility. And any organisation that doesn't invest in their employees' development in these areas just won't be able to succeed in a constantly changing world. We're already seeing tools that measure cognitive ability and these types of essential skills. And I was on a panel recently with someone from a US tech company who suggested that she thinks that this might actually reduce inequality in the workplace, because these skills might have been developed more strongly if you grew up with higher levels of struggle. You've become more resilient over time. You've become more flexible. You can respond to a changing environment. Now, I'm from the Australian HR Institute, Alicia, as you've already said. So I've naturally been considering what HR needs to do to enable their organisations to thrive into the future. First of all, HR has to maintain its leading position in the organisation that many HR practitioners have gained in the crisis. They also need to continue to take a strategic view of the business and its employees to support future growth. HR is also going to be taking the lead on embedding the necessary change ability, resilience, creativity, curiosity, and long-term strategic workforce planning will be a key component of HR's role into the future. I think an absolutely necessary component that HR is going to need to do is to access data and analytics. So they have to have access to that technology and the tools that provide this. And I also think that we're going to see an unusual new bond between HR and the Office of the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. And they're going to have to partner strategically, because the bond between people and technology is only going to grow stronger. As technology such as AI progresses, employees' job roles and skills are going to need to change and grow to take full advantage of that technology, which then brings us back to those essential skills of changeability, creativity, imagination, resilience, and of course, digital competency. I think I'll leave it there, Alicia.
Sarah, your notion of organisations having change capability, or as you so eloquently put, being change able, is really critical, because we've all had our business models challenged. And if we take those lessons and combine them with the solid sense of the essential skills we need to empower our workforce, we can get a real clear sense of HR's role now and into the future. Thank you, Sarah. I know our next speaker will agree with Sarah that things will never go back to normal, and they shouldn't, because right now we're all a little outside of our comfort zone, and the beauty is that is where transformation starts to take effect. I'd like to introduce Razor Buckley, who joined the American Chamber of Commerce as General Manager for South Australia. Prior to this, Razor worked for global media companies including Lucasfilm and BBC, as well as her own communications company with clients such as Disney and Sony Entertainment. Razor, with your international relations and global lens, what changes are you seeing take effect in regards to how we may nurture our international relations?
Thank you, Alicia. So from a very macro point of view, I think I'll start. At AmCham in general, we've become more of a national organization. Pre-COVID, each state had its own general manager. For example, I was general manager of South Australia and its own event manager. Quite often we were doing the same things within each state and not collaborating. We cared about our own backyard, our own budget, our own revenue. But what's happened as a result of COVID, which has been really positive, is we're now focused on a larger picture. And each of our leads now look after membership events, sponsorship, but ultimately we've gone back to our core values. So when what COVID's done for AmCham is help us focus on our core values and what we stand for. The American Chamber of Commerce is a B2B organization focused on trade and investment between Australia and the US. It's really important for Australia to keep engaged with our trade and investment partners, whether they're the US or other partners. And COVID-19 may be a catalyst for unearthing potential new revenue streams. The alliance between Australia and the US is very deep, and some people on this call mightn't realize how deep it actually is. This is some history, but back in May 1942, Australia and the US fought side by side in the Coral Sea to protect Australian sovereignty. Over 300,000 Americans gave their lives during World War II in protecting the Pacific and our home. This is something most young Australians are not aware of, and the core of our security and prosperity since World War II is the US. Freedom and security is something that we often take for granted, but most recently, last Friday, our Prime Minister here reminded us that there are increasing national security threats, and these threats are cyber threats. And these threats will also affect our economy, such as COVID-19 has. So how do we work together? Our economic security really does depend on what we do post-COVID, post-threats. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the US and sort of inform people that the US is the largest foreign investor in Australia. It's the largest foreign taxpayer in Australia and the largest foreign employer in Australia. So that is a huge thing when you're thinking about HR policies. Most of us, sometime in our lifetime, have probably worked for a US company, whether it's a large US company or whether it was their first job at McDonald's. People, if they look back on their work histories, will see that they've worked for US companies. And a lot of our HR policies do actually come from policies that have been implemented within the US. US companies are still looking to expand in Australia even during this COVID time, and there's even been more interest because of our secure and friendly economic environment. And vice versa, we're looking to the US for capital because the US capital markets are broad and deep, and we need access to this capital to help stimulate growth back here. So, this is definitely a two-way partnership. Australian companies enjoy investing in the US for multiple reasons. There's low sovereign risk, there's IP protection, there's low taxes. In fact, Trump lowered taxes when he came into power. So, yeah, what we've done at AmCham is move from a state-based focus to, with a GM sitting in each state looking at their own backyard, to a national organization adopting best practices and streamlining our activities for our members. Prior to COVID, our revenue was split 50-50 between membership and what we did with events. And obviously everyone knows that events pretty much disappeared overnight. Well, person events, not online events. So we actually switched our events to the online version. And again, we got rid of all the extra fluff that we have done in the past, and we really focused on our core values of business opportunities between the US and Australia. And if you look on our websites, you'll see that, you know, we're just finishing up a series on space, which has been 5 episodes looking between what's happening with our own space agency here based in South Australia and NASA. With the jet propulsion systems, we're looking at data from space. So really exciting business opportunities going both ways. Again, we're doing wine, which we're launching in a couple of weeks, but that's to help businesses diversify. Obviously with our exports, we've been heavily dependent on the Asian market. The premium US market's a growing market for us, and also wine tech's a growing market. So we're focused on companies interested to go to the US, or US companies interested to come over here. Actually, tomorrow morning, we're going to have a massively lively debate with the ex-ambassador to the US, Joe Hockey, and the ex-ambassador to Australia, Jeff Bleich, on what's happening in the US at the moment, and how that's going to impact Australia. Because ultimately, a lot of what happens in the US does impact business here in Australia, and you know, we need to keep these business opportunities open. Again, when I'm talking about work styles, one of the work styles that came out of COVID was the ability to go virtual, the ability to reach back to the US to get speakers. But we're also now finding that we did our first hybrid event yesterday in South Australia, and you know, people do miss the networking, the face-to-face when it comes to business, but also they like the flexibility of joining a discussion virtually. Not everyone is ready to go back to the face-to-face. So across the board, I think flexibility with people is going to be key for companies, and allowing people to host meetings, whether it's virtually or in person. So from AmCham, what we do when we talk to our members and to companies and to businesses, we say to them, you know, COVID means really look at new revenue streams. If your business has not remodeled and found a way to be viable in this new environment, as Martin mentioned, there are some industries that are doing exceptionally well during this period, but other industries that aren't. And, you know, we need to look at new ways of doing business, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's takeaway, or, you know, it has to be, there's all these different ways that we can possibly engage with technology, and we have to get our people on board. And talking about getting people and leaders on board, our advice at the Chamber is now's the time to experiment. Now's the time to potentially fail. What's worse? I mean, seriously, if you've seen half of your revenue stream disappear overnight, you're not going to lose any more by experimenting with something new. So we're sort of encouraging it, and we're doing it ourselves, and we're telling people to get out of their comfort zones and try something new, because COVID-19's enabled people to be more forgiving as well. We can't, what I had proposed at the beginning of 2020, before this all happened, obviously we thought at the Chamber, you know, it's going to be a huge year for us because it's the election, it's, you know, all these amazing things are happening. The US had just said that they would invest $400 million in space and in Australia, all these incredible things. Now everything's pretty much been put on hold. So we've really had to rethink it. But at the same time, we found that a lot of our key companies are open, and there's people are full of forgiveness. They know that we're all in this new situation together. They understand that supply chains, if you're in manufacturing, we can't get bottles out of China, or you can't get this. There's an understanding. So I sort of am encouraging companies and people to experiment, because now's the time to try doing something new. People will forgive you. Your bosses will forgive you. You know, it's a good time as ever. And I think that that's sort of where I'm going to wrap it up.
Thank you, Reza. And I know that we've had another conversation where we started talking about leadership and leading with humility and compassion. And I think that was a really valuable point that I might just mention on your behalf as well, particularly because we've seen political and business leaders embrace the fact that they are in an uncharted waters, so are letting go of that perfection to embrace that humility. And it's proving to be quite effective in times of uncertainty. Thank you. I'd like to tap into some tangibles. We're in the fourth industrial revolution because of the growing demand for both the digital and human skill set. So how can we use technology, per se, to unlock greater potential and embed this into our HR practices? So to give us this perspective with several decades of sales and business development experience in the IT industry, let's go to Brendan Murray, currently serving as Vice President of the Asia Pacific region for 8x8, who notably launched and dramatically grew interactive intelligence throughout the Asia Pacific region. And I'll also note that he's a veteran, having served in the Royal Australian Navy for close to a decade. Brendan, on the digital front, how are you helping your clients maintain that business continuity?
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, look at 8x8, we are a technology company. So as Martin said, we're one of the fortunate ones. For us, revenue has increased, and certainly we have helped our customers along the way. Look, our customers that have been with us for a while was basically business as usual for them. It wasn't such a shock to them as the ones that didn't have these digital strategies or work from home environments, or at least the technology capable of providing that. So a lot of our customers, as I said, just went home and worked from home. And a lot of others, we implemented their solutions throughout COVID and got them capable of working from home. Okay. I'll just talk a little bit more about what people have learned and what our customers have learned through this time. I think the number one, as was already spoken about, is people don't have to be sitting at a desk to appear to be productive. I think a lot of businesses have realized that people are actually more productive at home. Well, we found that anyway. For us, it's not a new concept, as I said, in our customers. We've been working from home prior to this event, but for a lot of organizations, with the, you still have the mentality of someone has to be at a desk to be seen to be working. I think a lot of that is going to disappear. I'd have to agree with the other speakers here that that's certainly one thing that'll disappear. As far as people touched on HR and hiring, etc., that has changed for some organizations. I think, again, with technology, it hasn't impacted it to that greater deal. If you were capable of having video interviews, like some of our HR customers did that, and recruiting companies, they simply just shift the face-to-face to an online meeting and being capable of doing all that from home. Some of the other things that COVID has unlocked as well, people talked about before how things have rapidly changed, and projects that were taking 12 months have been condensed into 6 weeks. It's something that, you take a positive out of every negative. And for years, we as an industry, providers of this type of technology, have been talking to C-levels and talking about the capabilities of working from home. And then we talk about the HR aspect. You can tap into talent that's never possible, because someone could be sitting in Darwin working for you and they could have those skills. So you tap into all that. And we've been trying to promote and this sort of work from home concept or remote working for many, many years. and COVID has certainly seen a rapid increase in that. So I think, but I don't think, I know a lot of businesses are actually going to benefit from this, being able to just have a disparate workforce, but with all the skills and being able to communicate like you're sitting in front of each other. But have to agree as well that it can't just be work from home or work in the office. It has to be a mix. And you talk about culture and collaboration. You have many different departments in every business, right? And just by the chatter going on around the place, people are actually learning as well. And I think that's the component that's missing working from home. And that's certainly my experience. I've always had a work from home and an office policy. What COVID has actually taught myself personally is I'll probably increase that from 2 to 3 days a week now, people working at home. But certainly you still need people learning off each other. And I think that's the missing component when we're all sitting at home. There's no chatter in the background and you're actually not learning by that way and listening. And a lot of things have changed, and I don't think business will change the way it conducts itself, but certainly there has to be different considerations now of how do we do things. And for us ourselves, you know, looking at prospects and how we go about, and you talk about events that disappeared, as Rosa said, and we had to reinvent ourselves during COVID as well. How do we now reach this audience without actually having people coming past the booth and having a chat and talking about things? You have to now have webinars as we're having right now and online events and try and educate people that way. But I think it's been a good learning experience for us as well from that side. Technology has always been there for us, but we certainly have learned a lot through this, especially on how to market ourselves. You know, some of the other things I think people need to take into consideration here as well is you look at the Gen Zs, they like their Snapchats and GroupMe and Instagrams, and then in the business environment, you have your things like your Zoom, your Slack 8x8. And, you know, I talk about this mix of working from home and working in the office. A lot of Gen Z still like their face-to-face time. So people have to be aware of that. You can't just make everyone work at home, because some people actually do. Myself personally, I'm a personable person, so I like having people around. So I don't like the concept of just sitting at home all week. And I think for a lot of people's, you know, what we've learned through this time too is a lot of people have struggled in our organisation. So we have, HR's played a key part for us. HR has been reaching out to people. We've had things like virtual drinks at 3 o'clock every Friday afternoon. We play online games and just make people still feel part of the office environment. But you know, one thing I will leave everyone with as we go through this period, everyone has to have this. I think it's stating the obvious, but before we try to educate people, but now by necessity, I think we've already started seeing it from the C level. It's now reached up to board level about remote strategies and how we're going to survive. And as I said, out of every negative comes a positive, and certainly businesses will be more productive and be better off after this event. So thanks, Alicia, and thanks everyone for having me.
Great to see the tech options available to us to expand, and how 8x8 are unlocking that potential and supporting agile businesses. Thank you, Brendan. Now, I'll just take a moment just to remind us, everyone, for those joining us live, that there is a Q&A feature, and we do encourage you to send your valuable questions to myself and Stephanie, and we'll come to those in just a few momentos. Finally, the man who finds his strength in enhancing workplace performance and just challenging the way businesses do business. Global Director of Design at Unispace, Simon Pohl, with several decades of experience leading complex projects throughout Europe, the Middle East, Asia and Australia, Simon has trademarked himself as a global leader in agile work styles across multiple industry sectors, delivering such groundbreaking concepts and award-winning environments for his clients. Really excited to have you with us, Simon. Now, you've had to put your travel on hold, but not your design inspiration. Tell us what you've been working on in terms of shaping workplaces for the future.
Thanks, yeah, thank you very much. It's been I guess, grounding, as you said, being able to stay at home because I spend quite a lot of the year traveling around the world, but I found it quite productive. And all of our speakers today have spoken about whether it's speed to market or creativity or remote hiring. And it's been interesting to see how that's now going to change the physical workplace. And if you think about it, the way that we've worked has changed completely, right? And if you don't think that, then someone that you're working with probably has changed. So we need to think about the tools that come along with that, the training that comes along with that, and I guess the types of places that come along with that. And that's where I come in. So we need to, we've been working with clients around the world for really about the past 6 weeks, trying to gather as much information as we possibly can. And I am going to now sprint through and share some information with you from those surveys and make sure that we're getting a little bit of context before we jump into not necessarily a solution that we've started to develop, but actually more of a framework to think about. So this varies around the world. So we're a global organization. We work on workplace and specifically the corporate workplace. So working at 3 or more days a week, you've got to think about what is the impact of that when it comes to the office space. Why are we providing all of this office space in a physical sense if people are already working at home? Now, these stats vary from just over 50% in the US down to 33% in New Zealand. Now, and these numbers have shifted over time. As you can imagine, people get used to coming back into the office for those countries that have. So quite interesting to watch those stats move. The other aspect to think about is the people that we've asked also have said, you know what, I love this working at home and I really am enjoying it, and for all the reasons that you mentioned, but actually I still want to keep my desk in the office. So we're challenging that a little bit more and saying, well, are we being greedy? Maybe we can do more team stuff in the office and actually do our alone time at home. Now, interestingly though, it's about that role. And some of us, not all of us, can work from home. We don't have the flexibility of writers or working for AmCham or various other spaces, but they can work from home a lot of the time. And we call this almost the work from home or the remote working disadvantaged. Those that might have specific sites or specific software, or they just don't have the right home environment to be able to do that. So we still need to think about where they're going to work. And on the right, the 32%, I think that's a lot of it comes down to that management training, or thinking about, if my people have now proven through forced trust that they can actually work better from home, then why don't we give them a little bit more leeway, a little bit more rope? So that's probably about communication and chatting through that a little bit more. And that's where HR and that change process comes in. And I'm sure we've all got a list like this on their table or desk or somewhere, where we're starting to think about what are the good and the bad. And interestingly, probably on the upper left there, that we realized that higher focus, the time to learn was great. We also have control over our environment, and thinking about the fact that wellness comes from the physical, the mental, and the social. We can actually get 2 of those 3 at home. So instead of trying to bring all these wellness activities into the office, maybe we can actually get a balance when we're at home. We've spoken about the face-to-face collaboration and that lack of camaraderie. But in the office, it yin and yangs perfectly. And we've already spoken about socializing and that. We've actually just done a survey with 50 executives, and what they were saying, what they're missing from that working from home, or what they're looking for getting back to in the office environment, is that instantaneous and spontaneous ideas. And Martin, you mentioned it, and it comes back to that speed of market, but the decision making. So instead of going from a 30-minute decision-making process lining up with your diary, this is where those water cooler moments and these areas and these spaces where you grab someone as they're walking past your desk, as was mentioned. But on the right, we've actually got some endemic issues in the open plan office. Lack of focus, poor acoustics, and noise comes up time and time again over the last 8 years in our global surveys. So what we're saying is, as that's been mentioned before, it's the balance and it's the yin and yang between the two. So if you start to consider between 20 to 60% of the workforce, and you saw the average of in the 40s, looking to work from home 3 or more days a week, that equates to about 10 to 30% of the office space is going to be vacant for most of the day. Now, we also know that on average, about 42% globally of your desks in your offices, if you're at a one-to-one desking arrangement, is already unoccupied because of sick leave, annual leave, working in a client's office, or working elsewhere in the office. So if you start to add that up, that's actually quite a big period of time, up to 80%, that this piece of laminate, this chair, and this monitor, and even that pot plant is not being used during the day. So it won't take long for those that are writing the checks for the organization to walk around the floor plate and realize that these pieces of furniture are not being used. So we need to think about it in a different way. So looking forward, now we've got let's imagine it's January 2022. We've got a vaccine in place, we've had our shots, and we're starting to look to the future of what this is going to look like. So as we know, we've developed these new superpowers, but there's been some trends that have been happening over the years that we're also taking advantage of. And so for those that are looking to do something new, we can add these on top of it. One is side-by-side problem solving. Speed, more for less in a shorter period of time is what all of our clients are asking for. Two heads are better than one is the way that we're starting to solve it. So think about the types of spaces in the workspace that need to do this. The other bit, and we spoke about creativity and collaboration, and Sarah was developing those ideas. What are the types of spaces that need to handle that? What types of technologies? And what are the types of people that need to lead that? Whether they're Scrum leaders or innovation leaders, this is a different kind of conversation, not just meetings for presenteeism. The other bit is that social aspect. We're probably lucky that the pubs and bars opened up before the workspace did in some parts of Australia and some parts of the world, but we're really still looking forward to getting together, having a coffee, having a beer. And while the quarantinis were great and fun, and the puzzles, they wore pretty thin after the first month. And Brendan, I'm not saying that yours aren't great, but we're getting the feedback that they do wear thin over time. So we've got to think about, what is the office for? What's the value of the office? It's got to be where people come. And I've got a little saying, and you can't use this, but it's, if you're going to work alone, work at home. If you're going to work with a team in the office, you must be seen. So think about, what is the value of the office, and what are the spaces and the places and the technology that you need to make sure you're getting back to work. So we've got an overlay or a framework called Propeller, and I'll show you what that means. So I'm not going to say in the olden days, but the way that you'd start to measure the way that people work and what we call their work style persona is you measure the period in which they focus, they collaborate, they socialize, and they learn. We then do top-down, bottom-up surveys, utilization studies, workshops, engagement sessions, and then we plan the physical space around that, and voila, you have an office. We did a piece of research, however, that pushed out to 2030 to see who were going to be the main occupants within a workspace at that period of time, and how were they going to learn. And the digital natives, being Gen Y and Gen Z, were going to be 55% of the working population. And they were already working digitally. They were doing these 4 work modes that we were doing in an analog way 4 months ago in a digital way, and on multiple devices at the same time. Then all of a sudden, March came along, and all of us were digital natives overnight. So we had to learn tools. We went through the sharpest change management program of our entire lives. And one partner said to me, he said, I've learned, this is of a law firm, said, I've learned more in the first 6 weeks of being in lockdown around software and hardware than I have in 40 years of practice. So think about what that means to the new office of the future. So now you get an idea why it's called Propeller. So on the left, there's our 4 work modes. And what we do is we wrap them around the business drivers and the needs, and we start to plan the physical space. But these 3 areas have been where the main shift is. So if we've just said that most of us, and 85% of us, can actually do our focus work at home, which is echoing what the other panelists were saying. And therefore, why do we need the office? Well, that problem solving piece. 2 heads are better than one. We've also got that innovation piece, which are more around workshops than meetings. It's a collaboration between collaboration and learning, and making sure we're outcome focused, not just running through minutes and meetings and agendas. Making sure those outcomes are thrown to the cloud, spread around, making sure the right people get the information, you can start on the front foot for the next one. The other piece, and potentially a big piece for a lot of organizations, is around community. So community is where your clients, your customers, your brand, and your culture sits, but it's also where you start to generate that tight network with your people. Now, if 47% of the people are going to be out of the office 3 or more days a week, there's a lot of focus around this community space and getting this right. So at the center of our Propeller is experience. So this is the DNA of the organization, but it's also the experience. Now that people are having a choice, do they stay at home or do they come into the office? Let's get them into the office. Let's make sure they're there and sharing knowledge with their team. So data on the left, this is from our global surveys over the last 8 years. About 60% of what we do is focus, individual focus work, collaboration 25, and the other 15 social and learning. And if 85% of us can do 60% of our work week at home, then again, why have we got all of these desks occupied or dominating the office space? We can then start to think about what the biases of the organization is, or what areas or industry they sit in or sector. And therefore we can start to attribute some of those areas within the workspace. So say you've got 1,000 square meters, you can start to break it up depending on what your bias is. So for some organizations in tech or pharma, it's more of an innovation. So you're not starting to say, how many people do I have, therefore how many desks do I have? Let's work out how much innovation space I need for my teams to work together. So we've actually got this great propeller that works at home. We're able to do our focus work at home. We're able to do our learning, a lot of the online learning at home. Yes, the learning by osmosis and that mentoring needs to happen in the office, but that's normally in pairs. And we've also got two out of the three wellness components that we can get at home. And that's wrapped around the trust that was mentioned earlier. If we think about the office, we've got spaces, people to get together, side-by-side learning in that problem-solving space. We've got the innovation, we've got the right technology support, not only people that are in the office, but actually remote as well, thinking about how we can now hire remotely. And then the community space wrapped around a great experience. Then we're starting to get this really lovely overlapped blended work where people have the autonomy, but they've also got the empowerment to choose where they work and when they need to work, wrapped around a great experience, wrapped around the right technology. And what our clients are telling us is they're expecting that out of this, there's probably 20 to 30% less space requirement. But what we want to do is make sure we're getting the engineering, the technology, the behaviors, and the spaces right to get that better space. So sprinting through that so that we get to question time as quick as possible, probably the key takeaways are we now have an opportunity. We've got one hand on the nettle, as we say right now. We've already been through this change process. We know it's changing. You can either let go and back to your old ways of working, or you can listen to what the panel said here, throw both hands on the nettle and go forward from there. Think about how to be more resilient and represent your client, your DNA of your organization. And think about those experiences. What are going to bring people in as teams and groups, rather than there's no point going all the way to the office to do 8 hours of emailing just because you're an adult and that's what your expectation is. Let's go into the office, share information, collect it, make the day better. And you're right, it was mentioned before that it's that combination of remote working and office working that will give people the empowerment and thinking about what they can do during the day to do their best work. Alicia, I've sprinted through so we can get back on time and get into some questions, but I'm looking forward to what comes out of this.
And it was superbly succinct. Thank you, Simon. Look, this is next level workspace design innovation, capturing the best of both work and home. And I love your emphasis on the employee experience and being very conscious of the why. It's just pure brilliance. We are going to switch to Q&A right now. Now, I'm going to throw it the very first question to our very own Paul Woppert here. And this is a beautiful question. So I'm going to open this to anyone. Now, why do you think that some of this unexpected value, you've mentioned it several times, is only found or released in times of crisis? So what is it about business as usual that gets in the way of creativity, new approaches, enhanced productivity? And how are you going to make sure that we don't fall back into old habits that unwittingly get in the way of good outcomes? Who would like that one? Simon? I
can take a little bit of it. And so I think that the physical workspace, obviously I'd say this, but you know, it's interesting how you go back. Think about your car. When you get into a new car, you work in a different way and you've got different things in different areas and you're learning new ways. If you go back into the old car, you go back into the old ways. So we found that a lot of organizations, when they go through any kind of major change, It's actually the change of the physical, which supports the behaviors that goes into making a change like this. And that can be supported by brand, it can be supported by all the other elements. But I also find that that physical environment is a big reinforcement as you're in the space that something has changed.
Alicia, I'll jump in on that one too, if I may. And I think leadership has a great deal to do with this because, and also I think possibly rewards and recognition. So if we look at our own organisations over the last 12 weeks, and in so many ways, so many organisations have had change thrust upon them. They've had to adapt, they've had to experiment, they've had to embrace creativity, and clearly they've had to be innovative. Now, the question is, what do we do with that now? How do we make sure that actually becomes something more akin to, or that's how we do business now. That's how we welcome and that's how we innovate. That's how we research. That's how we develop. That's how we commercialise. How do we bring new ideas into our organisations? I think there's a great incumbency on our leaders to say, okay, well done team. How do we turn that into, sustainable competitive advantage for our organisations, for our communities, for our cities, which however we measure that. And I don't think we can afford by any stretch of the imagination to go through the last 12 to 14 weeks and then revert back to business as usual and see that as acceptable. I think there's an opportunity here for business. I think there's an opportunity here for society in so many ways. Because so many people would probably openly say now that, look, maybe things weren't too perfect before this anyway. So what does the new norm look like? How do we embrace this change? So I think reward systems, flexible work arrangements, how we build and lead teams, how we communicate, how we measure success, how we employ people, on what basis. I noticed one of the questions was about enterprise bargaining agreements. I think a lot of these things will actually change for the better as a consequence of what's played out this year.
And adding to all of that, I think that there are a number of factors. I think Martin's absolutely correct that leaders have a great deal to do to ensure that that rapid rise of change ability, the agility, the pivoting actually continues. There's something around employees actually being in our organisation at ARI. Our employees were absolutely thrilled with the rapid pace of change because it allowed them to do things that they'd been always wanting to do, but they didn't have the time. It wasn't a priority, but actually all of these innovative ideas suddenly became priorities for the organisation and for them. And so they've taken a huge amount of satisfaction from it. The other thing is, from a competitor point of view, let's say that company A goes back to the old way of working and company B continues to work in the same way that they've learnt to work in COVID-19, company A is out of business. So actually the competitive driver between businesses is going to also drive that. The other thing, and I think Martin, you talked about what can we do for our communities. I think the third thing that we're seeing is a higher sense of purpose in pretty much every organisation. I noticed there was a question around, do we think that businesses are going to collaborate more? I think businesses that aren't natural competitors will definitely collaborate more. But I also think that within organisations themselves, we're all now looking for a higher sense of purpose. We want our organisation to stand for something. And we've seen that in the global Black Lives Matter movement, where so many of us have made statements and commitments that we're actually going to change. And we are going to be actively anti-racist. For example, at ARI, we've got a long list of actions that we are going to take as ARI so that we can demonstrate our commitment to this and make a positive change. And that's going to also drive greater employee engagement, along with things like the employee-led workplace.
Alicia, if I may, I think something that I've been thinking about for years now, and you look at companies at board level, and yes, you have to have risk averseness in your business, but Sarah talked about HR and CTOs working closer together. I think what boards should implement as a strategy is actually to have someone in technology sit on their board and talk to them about the enhancements and productivity that does, and how that secures an operation and how that makes you more competitive. Because, you know, without naming names, but there are many, many large organizations that have got antiquated technologies and hampering the way they do business. And yet boards have accountants and everything else on there, but they don't actually have innovation on their boards. And I think that's the lesson that should be learned here. There should be more innovation at the board level as well, and drive that down.
Thank you. Sarah, I'm going to pitch this one to you because there was quite an emphasis on skills and the new skills that we're seeing moving forward. This question comes from Jacqueline Fellows up in Queensland. So with these new skills that we're focusing on in 2020 and beyond, where does that responsibility lie, or who does that responsibility fall to for skills development? So is the onus on the individual to go seek it, or is it more of a HR function?
I think it's a hybrid. I actually think that we're definitely moving from the situation where employers were expected to determine where you needed to learn, what you needed to learn, and how you actually got that. But I think we're really moving to a hybrid where there is an understanding around development needs, and there will be more and more tools available to assess your own development needs as an individual employee, but also as an effective working group. But I think the biggest change we're going to see is the delivery of learning over time, which is going to enable both employers and employees to take joint responsibility. So an employer, for example, may subscribe to particular learning platforms, and the employees will be given the time to go and learn in the way that suits them. So that is, we're seeing already the trend towards very bite-sized learning, learning what you want, when you want it, and how you want to learn it. And I think we are going to see more and more of that driving towards the future. So Jacqueline, I haven't quite answered your question, but I do think it's going to be a hybrid model. I don't think you can say it's either one party's or the other party's responsibility. It's actually both.
Thank you, Sarah. Martin, now Ray's kept you quite busy with a couple of questions on the Q&A, and I might just let you pick one from there if you would like to.
Ray had a question with regards to the what does the new norm look like in terms of a strategy for the business sector. And I think in many ways, Alicia and Ray, it's possibly situational, it's possibly even geographic. So I think what I'm about to share for, say, South Australia might be a different strategy for other states and territories in Australia, around Australia, and other provinces and other countries around the world. So, but if I look at, and again, it kind of almost harks back to what does competitive advantage mean for a business, for an organisation, for a city, for a state, for a province, post-COVID-19. But Business SA is working on a little bit of a roadmap for this, which we will soon submit to the state government. And we reached out to a number of chambers of commerce and industry and business associations, clearly a lot of members, and only as recently as yesterday, I worked on this for 3 hours with my board of directors. But if we look at South Australia, and I'll use that maybe as an example, as a bit of learning, but South Australia has always prided itself on being a very livable place. Adelaide's been rated in the top 10 most livable cities in the world for many, many years now. So that actually curiously becomes a very strong competitive advantage in the post-COVID environment. Healthcare system, the hospital system in Australia is exceptional. Now, clearly that is a competitive advantage for Australia. Stable government and good governance clearly also becomes a competitive advantage in South Australia. But interestingly, size of cities in terms of what the size of your city or town means, I think the notion of that is changing. South Australia, Adelaide's not the largest capital city in Australia by any stretch of the imagination. But because of its livability, because of its ease of transport networks and commute and so forth, because of its safety, because of how the government has managed COVID-19. We haven't had a case of COVID-19 for almost 4 weeks now. We were the first state or territory to come out of it, so to speak, in South Australia. And we'd hope, of course, we don't have a second wave, which we have no evidence at this point in time that we will. So, but then we look at what it means to the connecting towns and cities around any capital city, what it means to real estate and livability and affordability of where we live and where we work. And do we all need to be downtown? Like there has been an enormous gravitational pull around the world for decades for us to be living downtown. Urban consolidation has been the big thrust, but maybe the new environment's going to disrupt that. We thought it might have been automation. We thought it may have been driverless vehicles. We thought it might have been these types of things which are coming into society, which actually might change literally what geolocation and spatial relations means. But it actually could be COVID, and COVID could actually do it faster. So it's a really interesting time for governments, for cities, for leaders to rethink what livability means, what competitive advantage means. And I'll also overlay that with the South Australian experience. We have got one of the highest uptakes of renewable energy of any city in the world. And that, interestingly, also becomes an exceptional competitive advantage. I don't think we can ignore or overlook in any capacity the impact of environment, because so many people have reconnected with the environment during COVID in terms of probably their appreciation of it, the time they're spending in it. And we hear this kind of anecdotally very regularly. So environmental leadership, commercial leadership, technological leadership, and also what does this translate, or how does this translate to competitive advantage? I think we're on the cusp of an enormous change, and I think some of it's quite exciting.
I'm very humbled by all of your perspectives, and also for those joining us live, very humbled by your valuable questions. Apologies that we can't get to them all. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our executive panel, Martin Hazy, Sarah McCann-Bartlett, Razor Buckley, Brendan Murray and Simon Poll. On behalf of the Australian Institute of Business, we are very humbled that you could join us here for our live webinar on ISO Life Lessons and New Ways of Working. Thank you and good night.